Water Margin, 水浒传, is one among the 4 great classical Chinese novels. While it is not as well known internationally as Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it is actually tremendously more influential than most people could imagine. In China, it influenced generations of vernacular and wuxia literature, while in Japan, where it had arguably greater influence, shaped the course of modern Japanese literature, influencing anime, Yakuza, and even video games. That also explains why a while ago there was news of a Japanese director tapped to direct Netflix's adaptation of Water Margin, because it is a very culturally significant piece of literature for them despite its foreign origin. So, what is Water Margin? Why did it leave such a powerful cultural mark in China and Japan? In this video, I will tell you all about this unique classic and give you all the reasons why you should read it. Water Margin is a story about a band of 108 outlaws who rose against the corrupt and oppressive officials in Song Dynasty China. These outlaws came from all walks of life. There was Lu Zisen, a soldier who became a monk in order to escape the law after killing a ruffian to defend a woman's honor. Ling Cong, the army martial arts instructor who was framed by the son of a corrupt official who lusted after his wife. Wu Song, the tiger-slaying small-town hero who became a murderer to avenge the death of his brother by his sister-in-law. These larger-than-life characters were joined by farmers, generals, fishermen, doctors, tavern owner, Taoist priests, and was led by Song Jiang, the lowly scribe who became their unlikely leader. That's why, besides its literary value, this novel has a lot of cultural value for its vivid depiction of the daily lives of Song Dynasty Chinese from all walks of life. Some people have compared this novel to the Robin Hood narrative, but I assure you, these cutthroats are nothing like the Sherwood Forest merry men. They more closely resemble the Sopranos, deeply flawed characters who sometimes do good. Even though some publications have called them heroes, it is really a misnomer, because they really just stand for brotherhood and being 好汉, manly men. At best, these outlaws operate within the loose ethical confines of jianghu, or the criminal underworld. Jianghu is actually a context-specific term. It could mean a lot of things, but it generally means a society that is outside the mainstream. Martial artists may use them to refer to their own society, and so do gangsters, traveling entertainers, and so on. The point is, when put under the scrutiny of the mainstream Confucian morality, these outlaws would be considered as nothing more than a band of monsters. And that is why this novel is so captivating. It is rebellious, gratuitously violent, smutty, and immoral. Some adaptations actually try to whitewash a bit of the savagery by making some of the deaths they cause accidental, like how Li Kui accidentally killed a boy. In the source text, Li Kui, who was named the Black Whirlwind, actually killed the 4-year-old boy in cold blood to force a man to join their band at Mount Liang. Their headquarters, Mount Liang, was lined by a margin of marshes. Thus the name of the novel, Water Margin. The title of this novel actually has a few different English translations. Water Margin, Outlaws of the Marsh, and All Men Are Brothers. So don't be confused if the plots sound familiar to the other titles, because they are really the same thing. This band is not a happy-go-lucky group of jolly cooperators. There are dramas, manipulation, and internal conflicts as these flawed men fought against the government forces while balancing their own interests and their own sense of brotherhood. However, the narrative took a turn after they gathered the full band of 108 outlaws. Song Jiang, the leader, ended up requesting amnesty from the government against the will of some of his members. So the band of outlaws found redemption by finally serving the empire once more. This is a very interesting arc actually, because for those of you from non-Confucian cultural backgrounds, have you ever wondered how a Confucian culture would write their redemption narrative? In Western culture, redemption is usually framed in the context of Christianity, with some Enlightenment philosophy influences. But in general, in the West, The path to redemption is quite clearly defined. In Confucian society, however, it is a lot more ambiguous in comparison. What is righteous may not be filial, and what is loyal may not be benevolent. That is why in other fictions, such as Romance of the Three Kingdoms, even Cao Cao, who is traditionally considered as the villain, has his own virtues and following. The second half of the story is also the source of most contentions. After the 108 outlaws gathered and their positions were made official as the 108 Stars of Destiny, in chapter 71, the tone of the novel changed. Jing Sentan, a literary analyst from the Ming Dynasty, suspected that the story from chapter 72 onwards was written by another writer, Luo Guanzong. Yes, the author of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. According to traditional accounts, Luo Guanzong was the disciple of Si Nai'an. It was believed that he continued where his master left off and extended the work. That's why there are a lot more wars and logistical talk in the second half of the novel, resembling Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The second half do feel a bit more lackluster, as perhaps the younger Luo Guanzong at the time had less writing experience. But it is hard to tell how much did he actually write, and which part was written by other writers, or maybe he wasn't even the writer at all. The biggest problem with Water Margin is that it had a lot of versions. There is the 100 chapter version, 115 chapter version, 120 chapters version, and even the 70 chapters version, which was truncated by Jing Sentan. He thought that only the 71 chapters can truly be attributed to Si Nai'an, who was the true author. Jing Sentan was a very influential writer who wrote very important commentaries on Water Margin. But it doesn't mean that he is necessarily right about everything. I would say that the extended part of Water Margin still has a lot of cultural values, because this is the part where the moral discourse began. The second half serves as a mirror to reflect the Confucian sensibilities of the writers of the era. Water Margin is such a captivating and masterfully written narrative. Various writers, most of them scholar officials of the dynasty, have tried to make the story work. Had the story ended at chapter 71, then this novel would present itself to be a narrative about criminals and murderers who had successfully defeated government forces. This is not only considered as immoral, it would have also been considered as seditious. So that's why other writers made the characters go through a long process of redemption by serving the empire. Yet, it didn't stop the novel from being periodically banned through Ming and Qin Dynasty. That's why their final enemy in every version that's above 70 chapters had them face Fang La's rebel group, a band of rebels much like what they could have become had they not submitted to the empire to gain amnesty. Essentially, their final battle was a mirror match, and it was the most devastating battle they could have ever experienced. As the outlaws and comrades fell one by one, their final hard-won victory granted them a degree of peace. The surviving outlaws, now heroic patriots, were given their just rewards. But by this second half, the story of Water Margin had evolved from a story of adventure into a tragedy. The corrupt officials who caused them to become outlaws escaped punishment and succeeded in plotting Song Jiang's death. In most classical Chinese literature, like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin also has an extended downward arc after reaching its greatest height in the middle. So it is kinda expected that the ending of this story is heart-wrenching. What I'm going to tell you is a spoiler, but this novel has been out for 500 years anyway. At the end of the story, Song Jiang was gifted a poisonous wine by the emperor due to the corrupt officials' urgings. He was seen as a threat to the empire, so they had to get rid of him. As a proof of loyalty to the empire, Song Jiang drank the wine. But he didn't stop there. He tricked his most loyal follower, the tempestuous Li Kui, to drink the wine too, because he knew that if he discovered that the emperor made him drink the poisonous wine, Li Kui would rebel against the empire. So for all that talk of brotherhood, he ended up choosing his loyalty to the empire over his comrades. Well, to be fair, if he refused the wine, it would be considered as an act of treason and everyone associated with him would be punished or executed, and Li Kui was a serial murderer who killed without batting an eyelid. He could have caused tons more innocent deaths. Some scholars think that this ending is a cop-out, an ideologically driven rewrite by Confucian writers to whitewash the text from unacceptable thoughts. Jingsen Tan himself wrote copious amount of commentary to make sure that people understood the text in his correct way. Despite him praising it as one of the 6 works of genius, he famously hated the Song Jiang character. He considered him to be a hypocrite, and he thought that rebellion against the state is unacceptable in any way. Across the ocean, another person found the water margin narrative to be very problematic too. If these characters hadn't been criminals in the first place, then they wouldn't have to go through this inferior redemption arc, he thought. His name was Kyokote Bakin, the author of the Japanese classic novel Nanto Satomi Hakkenden, sometimes translated as The 8 Dog Warriors. Hakkenden is a very influential Edo period novel, Yomihon, which established a lot of the tropes such as collecting crystal MacGuffins in animes like Dragon Ball and Inuyasha. Those are actually based on the beads of Princess Fuse, which was scattered by her half-dog children on her death, because she married the dog that killed her clan's nemesis. It is actually a long story, you should check it out yourself. That scene was inspired by Water Margin's first chapter, when the tablets containing the demons was cracked and released the demonic spirits that would reincarnate as the 108 outlaws. Reverse isekai was a trope that's pretty popular in Chinese stories. Bakin wrote Hakkenden because he thought that he could fix Water Margin. It is just like how Siran, friend of our channel, was directly inspired to write Iron Widow after watching Darling in the Franxx. She thought that she could fix the story, so she wrote her own. Water Margin virtually exploded in popularity during Edo period Japan and helped kickstart modern Japanese literature. But before we go into the details for that, let's look at how this novel first entered Japan. The earliest copy of Water Margin in Japan was discovered in the collection of the famous Japanese monk Tenkai. It was speculated that it would have been acquired sometime in 1624. But Water Margin, which is pronounced as Suikoden in Japan, did not become immediately popular. It gained popularity around 100 years later, in the later half of the 1700s, around the middle of the Edo period. And why was that? Let's look at some of the historical conditions that make the popularity of this Chinese novel possible. First of all, the Edo period marked the end of the bloody Sengoku period. I covered the Sengoku period in a previous series. You can go watch it afterwards if you want to be caught up. The Edo period is the start of a long period of peace. With the lack of war and all the killings, the population started to grow and became prosperous. It also created a market for entertainment among the commoners. Various arts flourished, and art forms for the poor, such as the kabuki theater, was invented. Previously, most art forms, such as the No theater, were reserved for the elites and aristocrats. So there was a massive thirst for content among the common Japanese. It didn't help that the Sakoku, or the closing of Japan, also happened during early Edo period. So their access to entertainment was even more limited. However, what most people didn't realize was that Japan was not completely closed off during the Sakoku period. They were still allowed to trade with a few countries, such as China and Korea. Since the Tokugawa shogunate at the time was interested in Neo-Confucianism, it imported a lot of books from China. At the same time, the government established quite a lot of Terakoya, Buddhist temple schools dedicated in educating the population. Among the elites, almost 100% of them were literate, and among the common men, around 50% of them were literate at the time. So, with the hunger for content, large commoner market, high literacy rate, and limited import market, classic Chinese novels became tremendously popular in the newly formed commoner entertainment market. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Journey to the West, and Water Margin became inevitably popular. But according to Professor Kato Toru from Meiji University, water margin struck a special chord among the common Edo period Japanese because it featured a group of ragtag commoners, farmers, soldiers, fishermen, and people just like them standing up against the government and starting a revolution. In comparison, the indigenous Japanese literature at the time featured mostly noble Japanese in the samurai class, like Oda Nobunaga or Minamoto Yoshitsune. Additionally, literature that glorified Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the low-born foot soldier who became the Kampaku of Japan, was heavily suppressed because it was considered as seditious content by the Tokugawa shogunate, who fought multiple devastating battles against the Toyotomi. The reason why water margin had such impact was really because of the imperfection and controversy that sparked off a wave of Edo period writing spree. If only the story is slightly different. If only the ending is like this or that, they thought. So various Japanese writers started writing their own Japanese stories using water margin structure as template. So that's why there are a lot of Edo period novels Yomihon with the name Suikoden at the back, like Chusin Suikoden. It is the story of the 47 Ronin written with the structure of water margin. The word Suikoden was pretty much attached to all the different work that used water margin structure. This kind of literary works were called Suikoden mono. Water margin is also the source of various East Asian tropes. In China, it is the granddaddy of the wuxia novels. It solidified the notion of jianghu. It is also one of the first martial arts literature that described martial art moves vividly, blow by blow, and specified the martial arts style and move names. It even has a move name for an ancient Chinese football kick, named Mandarin Dog Turn Kick. It is perhaps one of the earliest examples of a named sport move before those sport manga and animes came up with those mega special moves. In Japan, it influenced generations of Edo period novel writers, and the influence can still be felt today. In the early 1800s, a series of ukiyo-e woodblock paintings from the Tsusoku Suikoden series became tremendously popular. It is a series of paintings of the 108 Suikoden heroes that became highly sought-after collectibles. This could very well be the start of the ensemble collecting trend in Japan, like Pokemon, and also the granddaddy of your gacha mobile games. This series of paintings also became very popular tattoo patterns for the Japanese Yakuza. It is not surprising, as they can easily see themselves as part of the group of 108 outlaws. Water margin is a very important piece of literature, not just because of its tremendous influence, but also because of how it depicts the lives of commoners in the Song dynasty. If you want to write about ancient China or your own wuxia stories, this is a good reference point, because even modern wuxia stories still used a lot of the tropes established in this novel. So I highly suggest that you read it. But if you can't, well, I have a good news for you, because I'm starting the Water Margin Summarized series. It is modeled after my Summarized Romance of the Three Kingdoms series, with the exception that I will explain the cultural and historical context of the period. Because in my opinion, the context is going to be much more valuable as an educational tool than the plot itself. So if you are not already subscribed, be sure to do so that you don't miss the series. Do us a favor by giving the video a thumbs up and share it if you can to boost the algorithm. Before I go, I would like to thank our patrons at Patreon for helping to make these videos possible. Until next time, stay cool my bros!